Hello and welcome to another lecture in the Abralin ao Vivo series. Abralin ao Vivo is an initiative of the Brazilian Linguistics Association. I am Miguel Oliveira, president of Abralin. Today, I'd like to introduce Neil Cohn, who is an American cognitive scientist, best known for his pioneering research on the overlap in cognition between graphic communication and language. His book, The Visual Language of Comics, and Who Understands Comics, establish a foundation for the linguistic and psychological study of graphics. He received his PhD in cognitive psychology at Tufts University and is an associate professor at the Department of Cognition and Communication at Tilburg University in the Netherlands. The title of his lecture today is Reimagining the Language Faculty, a multimodal model of language. Before we start, I'd like to thank Neil Cohn for accepting Abralin's invitation and to say that the questions and comments are very welcome in the chat. Please join me and welcome Neil Cohn.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen and we'll get started. So here I go, and hopefully that looks appropriately as it should. Thank you very much for having me. I'm very appreciative of the invitation. Thank you also to Asli, who's here, who you all can't see just yet, but she's agreed to be my discussant for today. And thank you all for whoever is tuning in. I don't know who all you are, but I appreciate you coming in and watching, and I hope at least to keep you entertained for the next hour plus. So I'm going to be talking about reimagining the language faculty, and away we go. So I think first, before I begin, I'd like to just give some references. The work that I'm going to talk about today builds on work that I first published in 2016 in this paper in Cognition, a multimodal parallel architecture, which builds on the parallel architecture model of language by Ray Jackendoff. Since that time, we've been expanding and refining and further elaborating on our multimodal model, primarily in combination with my colleague Joost Schilprud here at Tilburg University. Much of the talk today is going to be what's present in an upcoming article that's in press right now at Frontiers in Artificial Intelligence. So if you like what you hear, you'll be able to see the paper soon. And much of what we're doing, that is actually going to be about one chapter's worth of a book that we're currently working on with the working title of Reimagining Language, which is going to cover all of the sorts of things that I'm talking about today, which we're hoping to be out within a few years. We'll see how that goes, as people who've written books know. So let me begin by saying this, is that language and the way we think about language is, of course, canonically informed by the way we think about speech. But we think about language oftentimes as being amodal, and the capacity of language, whatever that means in this context, as being amodal and flowing into different modalities, whether that's flowing into the graphic form in writing, or flowing into the bodily modality for sign languages. And I'm going to directly kind of interrogate this notion today. And I'm going to, just a forecast, I'm going to come to the conclusion that maybe this isn't the best way to think about language. And we can begin with this, which is probably something you've seen before. This is I Heart New York, or I Love New York, depending on how you pronounce this. And this, of course, is seen all over mugs and T-shirts and paraphernalia, especially if you go to New York. Now, after this emerged, you started seeing this heart being used like a verb in other places, like I heart or I love making new friends. Please drive slowly. We love our children. This is from street signs. All of these are actual examples that I found in various places. They heart weddings, such as this Twitter post, and I heart transitive pictograph verbalizations, which is a T-shirt. And what we can see across all of these is essentially we have an abstracted construction where now we have kind of a subject-verb-object construction whereby the heart is mandatorily functioning as the verb here. Another way to put this is the heart is encoded as a verb when used in sentence positions. In addition to that, though, we also have a variety of other similar constructions, whether it's used for other locations or other types of meanings. Here, we seem to have a different sort of construction that generalizes this one step further. That is, you have subject, verb, object, where now the verb slot is mandatorily filled by an image. And that image varies depending on what that associated meanings might be. What this then implies is that we have a kind of inheritance hierarchy that goes from the very specific to the more general to the most general in encoded form. And in order to understand this, we have to have this encoded in our lexicon somehow. We have to know that hearts can serve as a verb in a flexible construction, or that images can serve as a verb in a variety of different constructions. And what that requires then is a lexicon that both has the vocal information here encoded through writing, but also the graphic information of the imagistic forms. So my question then is, what model of language can do this? And I mean this in two ways. One is, what existing model of linguistics can do this? And what would it take for a model of language to account for this information? And of course, we've seen similar issues like this before in the study of relationships between the body and vocal communication. For example, co-speech gestures, where we're combining speech with bodily movements. And the observations of the tightly knit relationship between these has, of course, raised sort of ontological questions like, are gestures separate from language? Are they alongside language? Are they part of language? And there's these complex questions about their interrelationship. Part of these issues that arise with regard to these sorts of multimodal interactions come because language is oftentimes thought about in the context of writing. And writing has essentially disembodied language from its multimodal production. Of course, writing itself is an unnatural form. It takes the natural vocal modality as produced through our mouths, with our phonological system, and links it to graphics, which graphics on their own naturally are for pictures. But instead, we make a link between those to now be essentially drawing sounds with our writing. And of course, the kind of bare form of written communication has recently become very salient in that we're now communicating ever more with interactive textual communication, in which we've once again started filling in multimodality to enrich this, such as with emoji. Now, one of the challenges of multimodality is it's often talked about as if these are holistic forms that are then interacting, like writing and speech interacting with gestures or emoji or visual narrative sequencing, as if these were holistic forms. But of course, we know that language is decomposable into its subparts. So speech alone is decomposable into a modality with our phonological structures, a grammatical system, and a form of meaning. So insofar as we can break down one of these channels into its decomposable parts, my strategy for addressing multimodal interactions is then similar, which is that we can break apart the interacting expressions into their parts and then see how those different parts are interacting that would then give rise to multimodal interactions. In the case of speech, we can look to expressions like the parallel architecture by Jackendoff for how these different components are interacting. So in a modality, we have our phonological structure, which has a number of different tiers of structure, including prosody and syllabic structure, et cetera. Syntactic structure is the manifested grammar of the vocal modality. And we have an independent meaning component as well for our conceptual structure and possibly a spatial structure linked to that as well. All of this information a lexicon is then distributed across these different structures, encoded into each of these structures. So a word like sheep has a phonological structure of various phonemes and their linkages. It has a grammatical encoding of a noun and morphosyntax, and it has the semantics of sheep as a fluffy white thing. This information also needs to link to a graphic structure if we know how to write, where now you're going to link the phonological structure to letters in this case. And all of this is distributed then, the lexicon is then distributed across these structures. Of course, we still have these same structures manifested in sign languages as well, where now the modality is no longer through the vocal apparatus, but rather through the body. And here I'd like to apologize for not having an actual signer as my example. But I didn't feel comfortable putting a signer that I didn't know who didn't give me permission as my example. So I'm just going to use these drawings for today. And along these lines, what I have argued throughout most of my career so far is that the structure of drawings, particularly sequential images, also have this tripartite structure of a modality, grammar, and meaning. And I'm going to elaborate on this for a bit because this part might be new for at least some people. So what I argued in my book, The Visual Language of Comics, is that graphic representations also have features of linguistic structure. I use the example of comics primarily because they're a fairly rich source of these sorts of visual languages. In this case, I mean visual language, particularly to the graphic form. So they have a visual vocabulary that's built of memorized units, but flexible enough to create novel forms that are ordered by a grammatical system, which uses grammatical roles, organizing those units into hierarchic constituents. There's cross-cultural diversity of these structures, so there's no universal visual language, just like there's no universal spoken or sign language. And to the extent that these are actually full languages, we see overlapping cognitive processing with other languages. That is, the same sort of neural responses are shown to images and sequences of images as we see to sentences. So I want to make clear here a distinction about what I mean by comics and manga related to this idea of visual language. Comics or manga from Japan are a sociocultural context in which we use a particular cognitive capacity. So comics are essentially written in, let's say, American superhero comics are drawn in an American visual language and written in English at the same time. Japanese manga are drawn in Japanese visual language and written Japanese. And this is the same relationship that you'd see to, say, novels and English. Novels are written in English. It'd be weird to say that novels are English or novels are a language. And that's what it's like if you said comics are a language. They are written in two languages at once. So if you're going to translate then a Japanese manga into English, you merely get rid of the written Japanese and instead substitute with the written English, but you retain the drawings of the Japanese visual language. Visual languages don't just appear in comics, of course, they appear in all drawn information. So you also have different sociocultural contexts like, say, instruction manuals, which they use their own unique quote unquote style. That style is reflected in the vocabulary of this visual language. You wouldn't expect to see a superhero comic drawn in this way. And that's indicative of its unique visual language. And it may or may not be combined with English, like this particular case, which came from a pool at an old apartment complex that I lived at. Okay, so I want to make clear here that I am not making an analogy between visual language being like verbal language, but rather what I'm arguing is that both visual languages and verbal languages tap into the similar types of abstract cognitive principles that operate in similar ways across modalities. It's just that we have studied the verbal languages much more than we focused on the visual languages and thus use those as our source of comparison. What those abstract cognitive principles might be, for example, is form meaning mappings that are stored in long-term memory, classes of productive and fixed schematic patterns, combinatorial, that is lexical items, combinatorial strategies integrating form and meaning, that is morphological strategies, sequencing using categorical roles, so that is parts of speech, organizations of units into hierarchical constituents. And all of this information is operating across, again, these structures of a modality, grammar, and meaning. So to elaborate on this notion of a visual language, I'm going to just go into a section now about what I mean by visual languages and some of their properties. And we can begin by talking about what might be a visual lexicon. So we have established in the study of language that the lexicon of language extends across a number of different levels of complexity, going from individual morphemes to words that are either monomorphemic or multimorphemic, encoded phrases or idioms, and even syntactic constructions with parts filled in or fully abstract slots. All of this information is stored within our lexicons. And visual languages also have a range of sizes of information that are stored within the lexicon of visual languages. So let's start small. So these are all hands that come from the same comic artist. As you can see, it's a fairly consistent pattern. These are all drawn by the comic artist Jack Kirby, who was one of the most influential American comic artists of the 20th century, created most of Marvel's characters. And you can see essentially the same pattern then exists in the hands that are drawn by contemporary artists like Jim Lee or Eric Larson. You can also see that they share similar patterns for the way they draw closed fists. So the argument then is that when these authors need to say draw an extended outright hand, they say, okay, let me pull up this pattern that I'm using in order to draw this representation. And it would be encoded in their lexicon, something like this, where you have a modality that expresses some configuration of lines that maps to a meaning here of an object of a hand with the property of being open. And it has also a mapping to a spatial structure. There's also an encoded component here for what we might call morphosyntax or a morphology, but I'm going to leave that out for simplicity today. Another example is at the smaller level, this style of Japanese visual language, which has a very recognizable style of the ways that they draw eyes and head shapes and mouths and noses and bodies and all sorts of things that are recognizably at a glance of what it looks like for somebody to draw people in Japan. And this might be encoded in a visual lexicon with a particular configuration of lines to depict the graphic structure, and then corresponding to meaning, where it's an object of an eye that is open and it might have a property of some type of emotional state that it's conveying, anger, happiness, etc. And this, of course, also maps to a spatial structure of what an eye looks like, because this is iconic, and thus there's a more tightly coupled relationship between the graphic structure and this spatial structure in this case. All drawing systems and drawn information use these sorts of bits of stored information in the way that people draw. And at a glance, you can tell that these various examples come from different locations, time periods, et cetera, that you can at least have a general sense of. And that indexicality to where those things come from is indicative of the varying ways in which they have these stored visual lexicons. In the same way that you can recognize that the sounds of somebody's speech marks them as coming from a certain place or location in geography. In the case of these drawing systems, you can often identify where what the nature of the abstracted lexicon is like by looking at how to draw books. So how to draw books are essentially teaching you the idealized forms of these different vocabularies. How to draw manga is how to draw a Japanese visual language book. How to draw comics the Marvel way would be how to draw American visual language from the 1970s. All of these are encoding different types of visual vocabularies. We also see in larger forms, larger levels of encoded information. So in these representations, you can probably see there's these small forms. These are same open hands here, same closed fists, repeating across these images. But the central forms here are all essentially in the same pose. So not only are they built of small systematic forms, but there's also a larger form here that is systematic across this author's representations of a person punching with their right hand. You see all sorts of these types of schematic patterns in comics, whether it's a big head schema or horizontal eyes or reaching back the right arm specifically to punch from manga, or a scope panel, which is then somebody looking through either a telescope or a scope of a gun, which has essentially an open slot for whatever is being looked at. You also can have recognizable forms serve as the base for other variations. So these are the comic covers from the first appearance of Superman and the first appearance of Spider-Man. And people have long used these as the base for other variations of representations. Essentially, this is the origin of parodies or homages. And this is how many memes come about. You also see this in language, where you take a stock phrase and use it as the base for a variety of different variations on that same phrase, what Giora would call an optimal innovation, and what has been called in the visual form a visual optimal innovation. Of course, if you no longer know what the base might be, it simply becomes an abstracted scene level schematic pattern. Here, you might call this the under the legs schema, whereby you have a larger figure and then people further away who you see through somebody's legs. I don't know if you would reference this in terms of a particular origin, but there's certainly an abstracted pattern that's encoded for these authors. You also have forms that elaborate on more iconic representations. For example, you can do affixation, where you have hearts or a speech bubble or a giant sweat drop, or motion lines are all types of affixes that attach to a stem of a more iconic base, often a person, to convey speaking or being in love, etc., in the same way that you might have an affix attached to the stem of a word. You can use replacement as a strategy as well, replacing hearts for eyes, half of Spider-Man's face for his mask, giant circles for legs. These are all replacements, just the same way we might supplete things to elaborate on meaning in visual form. You can also do reduplication or repetition. In these bottom examples, in the first one, Calvin is skipping rope here. It's not that he has multiple ropes, but the rope is in motion. It's not that in that last panel, Calvin has multiplied to become more Calvins. He's being shown in motion. In this example from Tintin, Tintin hasn't multiplied, but rather Snowy is drunk and seeing Tintin with double vision. And thus you have reduplication as a method of showing that elaborated meaning. Some of these forms also have systematic tendencies. For example, these are all elements that float above characters' heads. They're essentially affixes to the head that are up, that elaborate on the meaning of whatever that face is emoting or having a cognitive state of. And because they're affixes that are up, we've called them upfixes. And these essentially have an abstracted pattern whereby the upfix has some higher up location to the stem of a face and is constrained by various factors. Those factors we've explored in a variety of experimental studies. I'll also say that this sort of visual affixation is what is employed by Snapchat filters, where you can then apply a range of these visual affixes to a human face now instead of a drawn form. I'll also close out this kind of discussion of a lexicon by talking about the development of drawing. Of course, development is very important for us people studying language. It's generally shown across the development of learning how to draw that kids go through various recognizable stages of scribbling, going into using different shapes in different ways. But right around puberty, they hit what's called a period of oppression, where people kind of stagnate in their drawing ability for the rest of their lives. And this period of oppression is called this by people in art education, or what's called a period of crisis. And I'd like to give a different framing for this, which is that I believe that this sort of period of oppression is actually the apex of a critical learning period for learning how to draw. And the notion that when people say, I can't draw, what they're talking about is a state where they essentially retain their resilient abilities of drawing. That is, the drawing ability that's retained in the absence of an external system of learning how to draw by copying, say, other things. And you contrast this with people who are highly proficient in drawing, such as most people from Japan who copy manga, which would then be the fragile abilities acquired through exposure and practice with an actual visual language. So it's worth remembering that all drawing requires building up an inventory of patterns within a visual vocabulary. It's not about seeing something in real life and then articulating what you see. And it's perhaps helpful to reconceptualize this notion of learning to draw as rather being acquiring a visual vocabulary. So if you feel you can't draw, it's simply because you didn't acquire a visual vocabulary sufficiently to build up enough forms that you can draw proficiently. Okay. That's a visual lexicon. I'm going to shift now to talking a bit about sequences of images. So how is it that we make meaning out of a sequence of images? Now, one possibility is we again simply make a mapping between meaning and modality, but we do so across images, taking stock, for example, of the changes that occur across images, changes in characters, changes in state, time, events, etc. This doesn't quite work entirely. And I think here is where we need the notion of a grammar, in addition to the modality and a meaning. And I'm here going to draw on work by Ray Jackendoff and Eva Wittenberg describing a hierarchy of grammars that has been posed as a more ecological hierarchy of grammars than, say, the classical Chomskyan grammar, Chomskyan hierarchy. I'm going to start with what I would deem as simple grammars, which is where the grammar itself doesn't really lend much to the overall utterance. This might be a single unit utterance, as you can find in cases like ouch, abracadabra, huzzah, or idiophones like boom, etc. A two-unit grammar is found in the two-word stage of language learning, oftentimes in compounds or pivot grammars. And we also have linear grammars, which are then lists or phasic speech, or what you might type into a search bar to do a search on Google in lieu of actually writing full sentences. We also find these same constructs in the visual form. So single unit grammars of a simple type, or what we find usually in, say, street signs and icons, emoji as they're often used, and more complex single units are found in individual, say, paintings or advertisements or comics or comic covers, etc. Two-unit grammars are found in places where, like signage, where you have yes/no options that show a contrast, or comparisons between different states of being, or in typical before-after images. Before-after images are often invoked as well online in different meme forms. They're no longer called before and after, but they're essentially before-after constructions, as we have described in a paper that will be coming out in early of next year. Linear grammars are essentially these sorts of grammars where you have essentially lists of things that are often guided by a larger semantic field. For example, here are things to do or not to do in different places, or here's what to do in the case of turbulence. These are all essentially linear grammars. You could rearrange the units in any form, and it all obeys kind of a broader semantic category. And this is also what you primarily find in the utterances people produce when they produce multiple emoji. They're usually doing linear grammars. This much alone is not enough to account for a sequence like this, where you can't rearrange these units around, and you clearly maintain some sort of co-reference across these panels and in a way that progresses across narrative states. At the very minimum, in order to understand a sequence of images, you need what I call a continuity constraint. That is, you recognize that the entities in one panel are the same as those in other panels. So even though the lines are physically different across each of these images here, you recognize them as all being Charlie Brown. You have co-reference across these panels. These are both the same dog. In fact, it's the specific dog of Snoopy. And if you have a failure of this continuity constraint, you would perceive these as being different characters. So this would be one boy, this would be a totally different boy, and the third panel would be a totally different boy. And these are both different dogs. In addition to this, you might have additional construal of what we would call an activity constraint, which is that changes across panels are then cues for changes in temporal, spatial changes as well. And here, a failure of an activity constraint would yield different scenes. So these are no longer connected to each other. These are each independent scenes that are not connected, whether or not you perceive them as being the same characters. If this sounds a bit bizarre as a construal, this in fact happens much more often than you might think. As I review in my recent book, Who Understands Comics, people who come from rural places, who are illiterate and who have little experience with visual narratives, actually don't maintain this construal of the continuity constraint. They would perceive each of these as different characters. And literacy and comics experience seem to increase this fluency. And it might not be that literacy itself is a determining factor so much as that might be a proxy for, say, enculturation, which visual narratives come along with. It's also the case that kids don't immediately get this for free either. So what I'm showing you here is an average of about 24 various studies that have used various sequential images tasks, well, like a picture arrangement task, sequence completion, narrative elicitation. What I've done is essentially averaged across their findings. Now, these different studies have all claimed to be showing examining different things, whether it's temporal reasoning or theory of mind or sequential reasoning or narrative understanding. All of these have reported different results for these sequential images tasks. But when averaged together, what you see is a very clear age-based growth. And so it might not be that these tasks are necessarily exploring any of the things they claim to be, but rather are more accurately describing the process of visual narrative fluency by children's understanding of sequential images. And it appears that between ages 4 and 6 is a crucial time period. So between 4 and 6 is when kids seem to be able to start understanding this continuity constraint. So all of this is a reminder for those of you, who use visual narratives as stimuli, that visual narratives are not neutral and universally understood materials that are used to be used as stimuli in elicitation tools and otherwise. They require a fluency also, and that fluency should be accounted for if you're doing experimental work with them. Okay, so beyond a simple grammar, you also then might have complex grammars where now you're introducing representational constructs within the grammatical structures themselves. That is things like categorical roles, like parts of speech of nouns and verbs, phrase structures, which give segmentation, and even to the level of recursion. In the case of a visual sequence, this would be a narrative grammar, not a syntactic structure. So there's no nouns and verbs of visual forms, which is why emoji do very poorly when you try to type sentences with visual form. So here, I'm going to start with an example where we have a sequence of images from a Peanuts comic. Once again, Charlie Brown and the gang are playing baseball. Charlie Brown hits a ball and Linus goes running. He then makes a pit stop and builds a sandcastle and then continues on to catch this ball. So many people might analyze this with, say, discourse relations in a one-to-one relationship across panels, whereby you note the changes in, again, changes in characters and states, and locations, etc. But I want to draw your attention particularly to 2 panels. So this panel here and this panel here are almost identical to each other. And you can see even better if I change the layout to make it a linear sequence, that these 2 panels are essentially bracketing this sandcastle sequence, which is a type of embedded clause here. And you can tell it's an embedded clause because we can separate these 2 sequences out, and both of them stand alone just fine in existing on their own. And what that means is you need to have some way of connecting these 2 Linus panels together, because no matter how big that intervening embedded clause would be, no matter how many things Linus does, he's always going to have to catch that ball at the end. And so what I've proposed is that there's actually a grammatical structure at the narrative level here, accounting for a higher information level that guides you through a kind of recursive narrative arc. At the top level, you have a narrative arc that progresses, and the same constructs are found in those same orders at a lower level of structures recursively. The embedded clause here is simply a prolongation, which is kind of a medial extender clause. And with this structure, you can then extract it out and you're able to have the matrix clause on the outside, or you can get rid of that embedded, the outer matrix clause and just have the embedded clause. You get even more complexity with things like this sequence from a manga, Real by Inoue Takehiko, about wheelchair basketball players, where you see that no characters here are repeated in adjacent panels except for these panels 2 and 3. In this sequence, this one person is seeing a guy play basketball and realizes that he has a disability like his own disability. And the way I've accounted for this is by introducing additional constructs and schemas that are not just the narrative arc, but also, say, conjunctions and head modifier schemas that elaborate on that narrative arc, just as you would in syntactic structure. And I want to make a point here that when we've done experiments on this narrative grammar in ERPs, you see essentially the same types of ERP effects as you get in studies of sentence processing. That is N400s, left anterior negativities, P600s, NREFs, late frontal positivities. We see all the same sorts of ERPs present. Okay, so all of that was said to tell you this, which is that we now have a model where we have a modality, grammar, and meaning across various different forms. We have it in the vocal form for spoken languages, we have it in sign languages in the bodily modality, and we have it in the graphic form for visual languages. Now, the question is, How do these relate to each other in the case of, say, multimodality? Now, one option is that we, again, have an amodal view of language, where language just flows out of one of these different forms. But I'm going to serve as an alternative model now, which is that each of these tiers of modality, grammar, and meaning have their own internal structures. Modality has all three of these primary expressive modalities present at the same time, along with a link potentially between the graphic structure and the vocal structure for writing specifically, again, mapping speech sounds to graphics. The grammatical structure has the potential for either simple grammars or complex grammars, and all of this links to a multimodal base of meaning that is a conceptual structure that unifies information across different sensory modalities. And then you have correspondences across these different structures. And individual expressions are then emergent interactive activation states across this larger parallel architecture. So let's begin by describing these unimodal expressions. So individual single unit grammars are manifested in these single words like abracadabra, yikes, etc. This would be the vocal form using a simple grammar that maps to meaning. Simple grammars in single unit images, like is found in the way we draw houses or stick figures or emoji. These are all essentially graphic emblems, which are graphic forms of simple grammars, one unit grammars in these cases, that again express meaning. Linear grammars of sequential images are simply a slightly more complicated simple grammar. Here a linear sequence that again maps to meaning. Individual gesticulations, which would not be stored in memory, along with gestural emblems like peace or thumbs up, would be stored in memory, are again simple grammars of single units that again convey meaning in the bodily form. Spoken languages that have a syntactic structure and more complexity would then use a complex grammar, where now you have value added in your combinatorial system, which then maps to meaning. This would be sentence structure. Written languages would involve an additional link to the graphic structure then, because now it's not being articulated through sound, but through graphics. And sign languages would then use the body using complex grammars to convey meaning with a different level of complexity. And finally, we get to our visual languages, which then use the graphic form in a complex grammar to convey meaning. In this case, I want to reiterate that because the lexicon is stored, distributed across these structures per lexical items, you might have different representations. So the complex grammar of a visual sequence is a narrative grammar, not a syntactic structure of nouns and verbs, but it's using the same combinatorial principles. Okay, so again, languages emerge based on development of which structures you happen to develop. So in the case, all of us come essentially with a grounding of resilient abilities for all of our modalities to have some sort of simple grammar to express meaning. That is, all of us can gesture, or at least all of us who have the capacity to, can gesture, can draw at least simple things. But there's a fragile system that would require then exposure and practice with any given structure, that is, to learn full languages. So what this means then is that even though I am not fluent in a sign language, I still retain the resilient ability to gesture. And my lack of fluency in sign language is the same status as a person who's deaf, who has no access to a spoken language and only signs a sign language. We both have a lack of ability of one type of language, depending on which parts we have access to, whether through disability, they being deaf, or through cultural inclinations by the fact that I've just never been exposed and learned a sign language with a true proficiency. All of these modalities are available concurrently at the same time as part of one holistic system. Okay, so multimodality then involves interactions of these different emergent states within each substructure. And within each substructure then, there are different types of unique interactions that arise depending on which of those tiers it is. That is to say, there's different types of interactions of modalities, of combinatorial systems, and of meaning. I'm going to go very quickly through interactions of modality and meaning, and then focus primarily on the combinatorial grammatical interactions. So starting with modality relationships. First of all, speech and gesture might be corresponding in a sensory form between their alignment in time. That is through the feature that they both are durative. They have a temporal correspondence. I can gesture as I'm talking, and my gestures correspond to what I'm talking about in time. The spatial form of text and image don't have this temporality available. And so you have to do spatial correspondences. So you might have an inherent relationship where text is inside the world of the pictures. You might have text linked to the pictures through a kind of visual morpheme, like a thought bubble or a speech balloon. You might have them adjoined through some sort of spatial proximity, like a caption, or you might have them fully independent of each other, as what we find in most academic articles, where the semantics of the text, i.e. figure 1, tells you is the index by which you can though search for wherever that indexed image is. It's fully independent forms from each other. And there's a range of kind of integration here, from stronger links of text-image relationships to weaker links. And that's all I'm going to say about modality correspondences. So there's temporal relations that can hold between different modalities, and there's spatial relationships that can hold when you have text and image combined with each other. Moving to meaningful relationships. Here, we're going to start with what I'm going to call semantic weight, which is which modality might be contributing more or less to any given overall multimodal utterance. So in a balanced relationship, again, this metaphor of kind of weight, if it's balanced, it means both modalities are well serving the overall meaning that is expressed. So in this case, you can test this through a deletion test. So if I delete the text here, you're clearly missing something from the overall multimodal gestalt of the gist. The same thing can happen in, say, single units, whether it's an advertisement or a meme here. If I get rid of the text, you clearly are losing information, and you would have the same if you were to get rid of the images and just have the text, you'd be missing something. This is different from imbalanced relationships where one modality might be extraneous or less important. In this case, now, the text is relatively unimportant. You can get rid of that text and still maintain the basic gist of the overall utterance. But if you get rid of the images, you're really going to be missing something, which says there's more weight in the meaning of the images than the text. Similarly, if you have a sequence like this, where the text is primarily in the text primarily carries the semantic weight. If I get rid of the text, now you're clearly missing something, so the text is clearly holding this. And you might tell here, in fact, there is no difference in these images. They're all the identical image over and over again, so there's really not much going on here at all. You can further identify the multimodal contributions of each modality by looking at the degree of co-reference across modalities, whether the modalities convey complete co-reference, that is, both text and image or gesture and utterance, convey the same information, whether one is included in the meaning of the other, whether they both have independent meanings but share in some of their meanings, or whether it's fully absent. And in the case of it being fully absent connections, you might need to fill in some sort of additional inference to make a connection between them. For example, the spoon and the coffee machine label. And that's all I'm going to say about meaning for now, which is that meaning can have a range of different types of co-referential relationships leading to a larger balance of meaning. And we plan on elaborating on this in future publications. And I'll say just briefly, I'm talking here about the kind of boxology level of these things. In our paper and in our hopefully subsequent book on this topic, we have been formalizing all of these component parts across the parallel architecture for how all of this pans out within linguistic formalisms. Okay, that's going to bring me now to the grammatical relationships, which is where the real meat of what I'm going to say is. So we've identified two different traits by which we think that grammatical interactions operate. The first is what I'm going to call grammatical symmetry. So when you have two expressions, each of those expressions may or may not have a simple grammar or a complex grammar. So in the case, if both expressions grammars are simple, we'd say that they are symmetrically simple. They both use simple grammars that do not use very much representations of the grammatical structure itself. There might also be symmetrically complex grammars where now both grammars have complex grammatical structures. And similarly, then you might have asymmetrical relationships where you have one modality or one expression, I should say, has a complex grammar and one has a simple grammar. So examples now. We can put the full model to use. So imagine an example where somebody's pointing and says this. Now, in this case, there's a temporal correspondence between how the gesture and the speech aligns. The word "this" is a single isolated unit, and the gesture is also a single isolated unit, and they're expressing roughly the same thing. So there's a complete co-reference here. If I were to also have a drawing that I am now pointing to, which is a single unit in the graphic form, there's a temporal correspondence between all of those things, and we add in a simple single picture to this mix as well. This also happens in, say, single pictures with labels, like in many political cartoons. Here you have a spatial correspondence between the text and image. There's a single image here, more complex image, and then say an emoji or a simple stick figure. And there's single words, multiple ones, but single words. And in this case, they are not necessarily co-referential. And so you have to do some additional inference to make sense of their relationships. In a case of a co-speech gesture that is asymmetrical, where you have a, say, sentence structure, it's again maintaining a temporal relationship of the fish was tiny, if I say that in gesture. It has a sentence structure here that uses a complex syntax and a simple grammar in a single gesture of the pinching gesture, where now the word tiny and the gesture are maintaining co-reference, but there's more information also in the vocal expression. This same structural relationship holds with, say, emoji that are used at the end of a sentence. Now you have a spatial relationship between these. You have a syntactic structure in the text, and you have a single visual expression of an emoji. They're maintaining the same sort of structural relationship of being asymmetrical grammatical relationships, even though it's a different types of modalities. Once again, as a political cartoon, as a single image here, we have yet another layer of complexity. We have, again, spatial relationship between these elements of an overarching single image. It has simple labels of single units of those words of climate change and world leaders. And you have then a complex syntax in the speech bubble here. So now it's an asymmetrical relationship at its most complex, which is between the complex syntax and the single image, along with some individually smaller units. Again, progressing to this example where we now have the text dominating the meaning, we have complex sentence structure here, but we essentially, the visual sequence is only using a linear sequence. Again, these are all the same image, so the image is not really contributing much other than being a visual list here. And we can see that a fairly simple grammar because we can in fact rearrange that same arrangement into being a single image or say a chat styled function. All of these have simple grammars of different arrangements of a single unit or a linear sequence, but with complex sentences being asymmetrical in all of these cases. This is a comic here where the author, this is a journal comic by Drew Wang. You don't have to read it, but he's essentially reminiscing about how smells connect to his memory. And you can see there's a clearly complex sentences across these different panels, but this is still a linear sequence. You could rearrange these perfectly fine because all the image content is basically a list about elements that have smells, different smells to them. And so there's just an overarching semantic field there. This is different from, again, a sort of narrative sequence. In this case, we have a complex narrative sequence that unfolds across the sequence of images. We have syntactic structure, at least of a somewhat basic form of I did it or I caught it. And you have a simple structure in the single word whap, which would then be a single unit utterance. I'd like to also emphasize here that that's kind of a characterization of the overall utterance, but these multimodal states unfold as you go across these units, whether it's unimodal for simply the image structure itself, or asymmetrical, or a simple complex, symmetrical complex relationship at the end. And there's also kind of a modulating trade-off of meaning at each image between modalities. Another example would be this one, where you have, sorry for so many baseball examples. I am American, though living here in the Netherlands, a lot of baseball. You have, again, Calvin hitting a ball where he then smashes a window, which is never seen, but is implied by that text smash. So here you again have a complex narrative structure across these images. You have simple words as in whap, smash, tinkle, ding, shatter, clink, and wow. And you have at least some basic form of a complex syntax in first try. Maybe that's a 2-unit grammar, or whether it's a complex syntax is debatable. I'm open to that. And what I want to highlight here is, in fact, that the cue in the narrative structure for this climactic panel actually doesn't come from the images themselves primarily. You know it's a climactic moment largely from smash. And this is a nice entry into what I'm going to call the second aspect of grammatical interactions, which is what we're going to call allocation. And allocation is the relative distribution of those grammars to each other. Now, in one type, we have 2 expressions, let's say, where one has a complex grammar and the other has a simple grammar. Now, this is what we call an independent allocation. And all of the examples I've shown you so far with diagramming have been these independent relationships. That would be like this comic I just showed you. Another way, though, is that instead of having these be separate from each other, one of the units from one modality plays a role in the other expression. That is, it's substitutive. So here, if we replace this full image for the word itself, smash now solely motivates the climactic moment here. You're getting the grammatical narrative role enacted by the verbal form. So independent relationships are where the grammars of different expressions remain separate from each other, and substitutive are then when units from one expression play a role within the grammar of another expression. So here's another example from the visual form that's more natural. Here, Calvin and Hobbes run into Susie and her snowman, and the whump is the moment where that climactic moment occurs, that is, running into the snowman. You don't see it. You only get that climax through the sound effect. So here we can say there's a complex narrative structure across the images alone, and we have a single simple word of whump, the idiophone here. But that word is also playing a role in the narrative structure of the complex grammar of the visuals. So it's co-indexed to 2 grammatical structures at once. So substitution, notice, does not use temporal or spatial interfacing because it doesn't create a composite unit. Rather, the units of each modality are a part of one larger utterance. And there's no co-reference here because it's neither imbalanced or balanced because there's nothing to be co-referential necessarily. So the grammar is mediating these units just the way it would for a unimodal sort of expression, potentially. This is what then happens with language-like gestures or component gestures, where you have a gesture that enters into the grammatical structure of the spoken utterance. You have the matrix utterance of the complex syntax in speech, and you have this simple single gesture of a gesture here, and that's playing a role here as an adjective within the grammar of the spoken language. The same thing happens when you substitute words for emoji for words, like John loves eating pizza emoji with friends, right? So here you have a complex matrix grammar of the sentence structure, and the emoji is then playing a role within that. And notice what happens when we do it again outside that structure. When it's outside, you now have a spatial association, and that might have the possibility of co-reference between that emoji and a form within the sentence. When it's substituted, that co-reference goes away because it's now playing a role within the grammatical structure of the larger sentence structure. You can also have substitutions at a larger level of complexity, like this, where you have a whole sentence. This is now Linus is looking angrily at Lucy, and you have this sort of text here that says, hey, what are you doing there? What are you doing with those pliers? Hey, and then you see her bike disassembled. Essentially putting text here got Charles Schulz out of having to draw the disassembling of a bike, right? But what that means is this text is playing the climactic role in this narrative structure. So now you have a narrative structure that has a complex narrative structure and a complex syntactic structure that is playing a role inside that narrative structure. So substitutive grammatical allocation then occurs across all of our primary modalities. And substitution is essentially diagnostic of whether a modality should be integrated within a larger communicative system, following our basic principles of linguistics, of substitutability. So the fact that the vocal, graphic, and bodily modalities all substitute for each other shows that they all are part of one larger system. So we can also extend these notions of grammatical interactions to unimodal expressions. For example, there's been a lot of work on idiophones by people like Mark Dingemans and others, and they describe that various languages have large inventories of these idiophones. Oftentimes, these idiophones go at the end of sentences where you'd have a complex grammar and then have the idiophone following that complex grammatical structure, just the same way you would have an emoji at the end of a sentence. But they can also be substituted into a sentence to play a grammatical role. Now, you have a single unit grammar that is playing a role within the grammar of the larger sentence where it doesn't typically go. And we can also characterize code switching by this same nature. That is, you have the matrix grammar of, say, English in this case, is serving as the larger form in which a second language is then substituting. These are just encoded in different ways within a larger architecture, but the same sort of grammatical allocation persists. And finally, we can come to what I'm doing right now. As a larger, all of this structure can account for what I'm doing here, which is I am having a temporal alignment between my speech and my gesture and the slides that you see. I have complex English syntax in my speech. I have gestures from my body, and I have simple grammars across my slides, which are diagrammatic, and potentially maybe even a linear grammar if there's more consistency across those slides. All right, so all of that is to say that this is the language system. You have persistent modalities that are always present, and it depends on one architecture for meaning making across modalities that then have different emergent states for both unimodal and multimodal information and expression. And what I'd like to argue is that this isn't just an instantiation of this model in our cognition, but also for those of us who study language, it heralds the need for a kind of multimodal paradigm of thinking about how language works. And I think, again, I can contrast that against what I would call an amodal sort of speech-centric paradigm. And in this case, speech-centric because the overall strictures of and beliefs related to language largely come derived from the way we think about speech. And I'm only going to characterize a couple points here, but the primarily ones is that the amodal view might view language, again, whatever that means, as amodal, flowing into different modalities in presumably the same way. And that language, again, speech, is the core system and others are peripheral. And I want to contrast that with this multimodal paradigm by saying that all modalities equally belong to a unitary expressive system. Languages are emergent states in a multimodal architecture. Expressive systems are then bound to the affordances of their modalities, and different languages might differ in the way they manifest things because of the affordances of those modalities themselves. And human expression is naturally multimodal. It's not the exception. Unimodal expressions are actually the exception. So all of this, it heralds a kind of multimodal architecture by which we can begin to ask additional questions then about how language operates. What does a multimodal lexicon look like? What does this mean for the way we think about modality, generality, and specificity? What does this mean for linguistic typologies across multiple modalities, or the way we instantiate language into computations? What does this mean for linguistic relativity when the modalities are all present in one larger architecture? What does it mean for language evolution? For example, the amodal view would look for transfer between modalities. But if this is the architecture, it means that all of those modalities are present within the architecture at once. What does it mean for the nature of development as well? And what I would like to posit is that we can arrive at a kind of richer view of our linguistic and communicative capacities with this sort of multimodal view than if we merely focus primarily our efforts on 1/3 of this overall multimodal architecture, and we can have a broader view of language and communication and their integration with cognition. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. Again, thank you for the hosts for inviting me, and I appreciate all of you coming and watching, and look forward to what inevitably will be a heated discussion, I imagine. So thank you very much. And I'm going to stop screen sharing now.
Thank you very much for this great presentation. So now we are going to start the discussion session with discussion Ashley Ozurek, who is a professor at the Donders Institute for Brain, Cognition, and Behavior, and affiliated researcher at the Center for Language Studies at Radboud University and at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics. I'd like to thank Ashley Ozurek for joining us today.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me well? Yeah,
I can hear you all right.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks, Neil. This is really groundbreaking, and you've really been a role model in getting us all into the new mode of thinking about language as a multimodal phenomena. And I also appreciate your efforts to push this forward. I also see your career in a way similar to my career, because I've also spent a lot of 20 years of my life trying to show that we should think of gestures and iconicity and the visible indexicality, such as pointing in both sign and spoken languages, should be considered as part of the core language system, but not at the periphery. So we are on the same boat. And I also agree very much in line with one of your last slides, where definitions of language should not be speech-centered, but they should move into a more multimodal understanding. So there I agreed with you, but the way you formulate how these multimodalities in graphics, bodily expressions should be part of language, I think I'm a little bit on a different frequency than you are. First of all, I mean, Ray is also here. I mean, it's very nice to see him here. Yeah. Of course, Ray's model of language is, one of the best models that also fit into some kind of cognitive models. It's cognitively based, and I think it can explain a lot of the phenomena, but I'm not sure whether, for example, I would use that model to try to incorporate these multimodal aspects in there. Let me tell you why. Because I take the bodily expressions, the semiotic affordances such as iconicity and holistic and the simultaneous nature of what I see from sign and spoken language, the gestures, don't really, I can't really fit it into that upper level where you see because you have the modality, and then it goes to the phonological part of Ray's model. But those phonological parameters are kind of detached from the meaning level. So there is no motivated relationships between the phonological forms and the meaning forms. But in gestures, some of the iconic gestures and also some of the iconic expressions in sign languages, I mean, not all sign languages are iconic, but there is a lot of chunk of iconic structures that they cannot be explained with that kind of into independent architectures where the phonological level is not motivated by the meaning, but that's what we see in the iconic things. So that's kind of my of worry about that.
May I respond to that then as a first question? That's a great question. And I would add within my sort of amodal centric views, included within that is the Saussurean sign as a linguistic sign and arbitrariness. And actually within our additional formalization, I didn't go into it here at all today because it's far too complex, is that we have actually accounted for iconicity and indexicality in this model. In fact, I can account for most all of Peircean semiotics now within the parallel architecture. And I think a key to this is letting go of the Saussurean notion of motivated, and so basically the Saussurean sign as what Michael Silverstein would have called the semiotic football, where it's the meaning and the form are two halves of one whole. And I don't think this is accurate at all, really. And if you read actual Peircean semiotics, he doesn't talk about this sort of unity whatsoever. He would talk about there being a sensory signal that is either idiosyncratic or systematic or regularized, what he call a sin sign or a legi sign. That's a property of the modality itself. So systematicity or conventionality is a property of the modality signal. And that's then going to correspond to the meaning. And the nature of that correspondence, say indexicality or iconicity, is actually an emergent property of that relationship. It's what Peirce would call the ground. Iconicity isn't a thing itself, it's about a relationship between the modality and the meaning. So in the case of iconicity, it means that there's some sort of configurational alignment within the modality that then reflects the alignment or configuration within a conceptual structure. In the visual form, this would be alignment with, say, a spatial structure. In the auditory form, it would be alignment with whatever auditory equivalent of a spatial structure would be. But that's a characteristic of the mapping between the modality and the meaning, not about the modality itself. And arbitrariness, then, is a characteristic where you have a conventionalized form that then maps to a meaning, but has no sort of principled reason for doing so, right? And so I think that actually all of these things very easily come out of the parallel architecture and are facilitated incredibly well by the parallel architecture. But it's a matter of reframing the way we think signification works away from Saussurean linguistics, which simply don't support it. I would also think along these lines that one of the reasons why we have a multimodal architecture is because different modalities might have optimal affordances for the ways they facilitate these mappings to meaning. So the mappings between the graphic structure really invite this sort of iconic interface to meaning. The vocal structure is very well attuned to symbolic mappings to meaning. And the bodily modality is really good at indexicality and locating things in space relative to the body. And that's part of the affordances of those modalities. As you know, all modalities can do all of these different types of meaning making, but they might be better or worse than each other, which again gives us a reason for having multiple modalities at once, which is they have these affordances which can complement each other to create a richer signal overall, where they're doing different affordances and different types of signification to tap into the same conceptual structure, or McNeil's growth point, right? And so I think all of this is very doable by the parallel architecture.
Okay, but I mean, I think this message didn't really get through in your talk. So
not in this talk, no. There's there's far too much to do in this talk. So, but this is part of what we are doing in our book. You're absolutely right. I did not cover that in the talk at all.
Okay, if I heard the talk this way, I wouldn't ask.
No, that's great. I'm glad you asked that as a question, because it's good to clarify.
I would say that's also different interpretation of Ray's. I mean, maybe I'm reading Ray's model in a different way, but I mean, in Ray's model, they seemed quite distinct from each other, the phonological and the meaning
well, they are, but that's the nature.
Right. But these iconic affordances you talked about, they cannot be separated so nicely. So that was my thing. But if you think there's a way that it still fits, maybe it's a different reading, but I agree with everything you're saying. So another question I had was like with regard to gestures. when you say it's like a one gesture, one simple grammar or one unit, I was again there, like I was thinking of how you think of like one, like in gesture, because of the holistic nature. If I do, for example, something like this looks like one gesture, but there are like 2-3 meanings here. Somebody is moving from right to left and moving, wiggling fingers and like, or slowly or something like that. So all of these things, I don't know how you can easily make. So, I mean, let's say something like this is not like a single word, or it's not like a simple pizza picture. And so I mean, I had a little bit difficulty where you were trying to put every modality like into one kind of, I know you try to simplify it, but that's a bit difficult, I think.
So I think that
those semiotic affordances would be treated a bit differently. I mean, it doesn't make it very clean, I know, but this way is also like chopping it up.
I think that in terms of, say, is this a single morpheme or not? You're more have the expertise than me to answer that.
The one
so you might think of this as a single unit utterance. Could be, this is an utterance, that it could be multimorphemic within that single utterance. It could also be potentially a linear grammar, as in there's different component parts that are making up a otherwise sort of linear sequence. I'm not sure if I fully believe that or not, but there are certainly ways in which one could segment a gesture into different sort of parts that, of course, like I said, you're far more the expert on this than I am. But I think that the key is that it's not using a representational form that might be encoded with, say, grammatical categories or a hierarchic structure of a phrase structure. And that's what I mean by a simple grammar. It's merely being motivated by itself as an utterance, which then might have a relationship to meaning, but the grammar, the simple grammar, is not contributing much to the structure of that form. There's no categorical roles, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, also, I mean, in your talk, I felt a lot of this sense of sequentiality and linearity, again, being the fundamental design feature of language, and again, fitting with earlier, like speech or written.
That's a good point.
Based notions, right? So I give this example because, like, when we look at gestures or gestures together with speech, there's a lot of simultaneity. Whereas the previous theories that you allude to, of course, they take linearity and sequentiality as the primary design feature. But I think we should expand that also the simultaneity should be also part of language. So I've been trying to do, like in the last years, is that we should expand our notion of language, including, let's say, arbitrary and iconicity or motivated form meaning mappings together, so they can be both part of a language, and linear, sequential, and simultaneous ones could be also considered as part of, rather than trying to explain the simultaneous ones with the sequential parts, instead of trying to fit everything else into the old views. That's what I'm trying to get away from. So that's why, like, when you were trying to explain everything towards sequence structures, like with that fish example and things like that, and because, for example, gestures, when you speak, they can kind of, their scope on the speech could be like a whole phrase, like a whole utterance. It's not like filling a little slot in the sequence, but it's like a prosodic like contour, and then it can overlap like a lot of chunk of the speech, and then you get another composite structure. So those are
I think that's
I think we should also like think about
I think that's a great point. And I think it's a great point, especially that the kind of sequential linearity aspect is another inheritance of a speech-centric view. I think is really insightful. And in our kind of larger treatment of modalities, this kind of simultaneity is then a function of the modality, the affordances again of the modality, and is a function of in the say multimodal correspondences, we have been trying to account for some of this simultaneity at the same time. And I think that's partially why we articulate these sorts of spatial relationships as interfaces independently, because it's all simultaneous temporally, right? You look at an image and it's all there at once. And so you have to have something other than linearity in order to account for that.
Actually, I always wonder why you always like focus on the sequentiality, but don't think about the simultaneity in the narrative, visual narrative.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely true. And I think that certainly is something that should be incorporated into those modality structures. Yeah, I am in full agreement with you.
So these were my general points, but otherwise.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much.
Because I come from a more dynamic system than,
No, it's great to have the additional insights. And before we publish a book, I'll send it to you and make sure that you have your feedback on it before to make sure we get the complete treatment from you. It'd be very helpful.
Well, I mean, these are just suggestions, like it's, I think it's just starting to think about this and, to think like how much the old models fit and then how much we need to expand. And I appreciate all efforts on that. So
great.
So I don't want to take more time. I don't know how much time we had, but
I can answer questions. I'm sure if other people have questions, I'm happy to answer them.
I don't want to take more time.
Yeah.
Wonderful talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I see there's a question from the chat. I don't know if you want to be moderating the questions here or.
Yes, I can read them for you.
Sure.
So the first question is from Bruno Porto. So simply putting, the main difference from prosodies and homages to schematic patterns would be the knowledge of the base image. I'm referring to the comic book covers examples you provided.
Yeah, so in the idea would be that parodies and homages have a base reference form where they are referring to the base and thus kind of able to pull some of the semantics out of that base, as opposed to a fully schematic form would then no longer have a base and it just has a schematic representation that you can form, but it's not referring to anything else. And he mentions, I see you typed his question in the chat. So I can see he's already checking this paper that we have called Let There Be Visual Optimal Innovations, which has that title because we do this visual optimal innovation for the creation of Adam painting by Michelangelo, where this is now used as the base for lots of different parodies and memes and things. And all of those memes are inheriting this sort of, finger touching sort of creation moment, and they inherit that notion. But if you've never seen and didn't know of the idea of the Michelangelo's painting, all you'd know is, hey, there's all these templates where people are reaching their hands and touching to each other, but you would have no knowledge base by which to pull from.
Okay, and the next question is from Fred Belcavello, and he's made some reference, I think, that for some of the topics and no more dominance assertiveness, and he says, what do you think of combining a fine-grained model such as FrameNet to account for semantics?
So no more dominance assertiveness is in my older model of the multimodal parallel architecture. I had these kind of phrases and descriptive terms for different relationships. And no, I have dropped out that terminology, which I think ultimately was holding back the characterizations of what was going on, and the terms that I use today are what we're now using. What do I think of combining a fine-grained model such as FrameNet to account for semantics? Well, FrameNet would just be a different sort of model of conceptual structure than, say, conceptual semantics, which is in Jackendoff's parallel architecture. I personally use conceptual semantics. It's what I'm comfortable with. I think it's a very good model for accounting for the sort of fine-grained semantic distinctions that we need to make. But if your flavor is FrameNet and you think that it can do these sorts of accounting for multimodal interactions, then by all means do so. You could slot that in for the conceptual structure, and as long as you can manage the sorts of interface rules that you would need between those structures, I think it would work okay. And how would film and video come in here? FNG would be the application of my narrative grammar to film. So I think film is drawing upon real life percepts rather than a graphic structure per se, but it might be engaging with similar grammatical structures of at least at the narrative level of the narrative structure of the narrative grammar. And film oftentimes, of course, begins with graphic structures of storyboarding, where you employ the narrative grammar first in drawn form before you then film it to sort of paint over it with actual real percepts. So I think film can fit fairly well here, but of course, film carries with it its own affordances of moving pictures that are no longer static and they're dynamic and they're actual percepts rather than graphic forms.
Okay, and the next question is from Alan Schienke, and he asks the following, sorry. I wonder if we actually need a semiotic theoretical framework with its own terminology for talking about these ideas, rather than employing the terminology of linguistics, for example, grammar, lexicon, for describing other semantic systems.
So you certainly could. I think that using sort of a domain neutral terms that don't have the hangups of what we have from language might be useful. I don't know, referring to, instead of lexicons, to, I don't know, libraries or whatever sort of terminology you want to use. I think that there's two things that could do. Either that would allow us to talk in neutral terms about all of the kind of domain general constructs that are going on, which might be beneficial, but it also might have the byproduct of denigrating different modalities because you're no longer using the linguistic terminology, unless linguistic terminology would, in fact, adopt those larger semiotic framework terminology. And so you would no longer refer to a lexicon in the study of spoken language. I think what has to happen is rather there has to be at least some domain neutral treatment of whatever terminology we're talking about, whether it's lexicon or grammar, as long as you have, we could talk instead of a grammar about a combinatorial system, if that's what we want to do. But as long as you have an understanding that there is a domain neutral way in which these things might be manifesting, and we have to use them in equal terms across modalities. I think it doesn't matter if you're borrowing it from one and now saying, and now we have to talk about the lexicon of everything, or whether you're referring to it specifically as some larger domain general principle. I think all that really matters is that you're using the same ways to describe things equally across all modalities of expression. Other questions?
Thank you very much. And you
sudden ending. Yes.
Yeah, we don't have any more questions in the chat.
Okay.
So, Ashley, if you have any more questions.
Yeah, I also had a question about your expectations, or whether you've done any research in cross-linguistic differences in the emoji use. For example, this "I love New York," of course, that has become some kind of a chunk, like a construction, and then you kind of put the English form, like "I love Istanbul," for example.
Yes.
but I haven't seen, like, for example, in Turkish, because Turkish verb is at the end, like I haven't seen Istanbul, like "I Istanbul love" at the end, for example. I haven't
That's a good point. Yes.
like that, but like, do you expect any cross-linguistic variation in
that's a really good question. Yeah, that's a really great question. I have no idea. I do know that, so our study on the grammar of emoji, where we made people communicate with each other using only emoji, we did obviously with English and Dutch speakers here in the Netherlands. I do know that there's a replication of that being done by Kazuki in Japan. So we'll see if the same sorts of results arise there. I know that there's a variety of studies about emoji in the context of Weibo in China, in which they have reported, similar sorts of structures as you see in at least English contexts. But I don't know quite enough of that literature to know the exact comparisons that might be made across all these linguistic contexts. And I think it's a really good point that, the morphology of spoken languages and written languages differ greatly also, right? So you have from, more agglutinative or analytic forms to, polysynthetic forms. You would imagine those interactions morphologically with a graphic representation would also vary by what's allowable by those different systems. And that's really insightful. And it could be, I think, having a heart at the end might be disallowed, even if you have multiple languages that are using the heart construction. It might be so entrenched that it has to be just subject, heart, object, that it's not going to be as allowable by moving into a different sentence structure. And I have no idea if that's the case. I hope that people who are in the chat, maybe who speak other languages, might know of examples where, no, we put the heart at the end or something. That would be really interesting. And I'm just not as aware of those phenomena. And I think there's, a lot that could be done with that sort of substitution. That'd be really interesting.
For example, for Turkish, not only because it's at the end, but like we put a lot of morphological markers at the credit, right? So you're going to be missing all of those.
Right.
The negation, the agreement.
There's no inflection when you substitute an emoji.
And that would be a constraint. But is that then what does this tell about your theory that I was trying to get at?
Right. Well. So I think what ends up happening in substitution, which we talk about more in the paper, is that with substitution, you're essentially coercing the grammaticality of it. So you have to do the co-reference and the meaningful associations in the conceptual structure, but then in the grammatical structure, you have to then kind of fit this thing that is not inflected, it's not of the right form necessarily into matrix grammar of a sentence form. But that's kind of a coercion. So you recognize that it's not completely accurate. That said, when we do see psychology studies that do emoji substitutions, for example, in self-paced reading, you get a large slowdown for the substituted item, but at the next word after the substitution happens, you don't see any more. You don't see any spillover effects. People immediately recover. But if you have, say, an emoji that is semantically odd, say, for that position, like I love eating heart at the weekend, right, instead of pizza, then you see an even larger reading time at the substitution, but it does persist in downstream effects later on, which implies that there is some sort of congruity for the grammatical structures to be integrated well into the grammatical structure or not on the basis of its semantic match for the fit of that grammatical category. Again, how that works for a language of a different type of morphological system is I don't know. But I would predict that there's at least some ways in which this substitution can occur. But it also might require interface rules for the type of grammatical system and morphological system that a given language has and the way it interacts across those languages. That might be also something that we build up over time as well, given the affordances of our different specificities within our systems.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a really nice insight.
Follow up on you on Turkish.
Yeah, sure. We should discuss. We should make Turkish speakers type in emoji to each other. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Neil and Ashley, for your collaboration with the series Abralim ao Vivo. I'd like to take this opportunity to invite everyone to continue watching our live lectures. Neil, would you like to say something before we end the transmission?
Oh, I want to say thank you again for everybody who has watched. I have no idea who's out there in the world watching today or yet to come. And also thank you again for your invitation. It's been a lovely invitation. And really thank you for Asli, who is a great discussant, and not only for replying to my own talk, but also for adding so much additional layers and insights. So thank you again, Asli.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and thanks, Abralim, for this nice opportunity. Yeah.
Thank you both once again. Thanks, everyone.